Hi, my name is Alyssa Roden, and today I'm going to talk to you about the effects of bombardment on the thermal orbital evolution of icy satellites. We know that impacts can affect evolution and global processes in a variety of ways, and here I've highlighted a few of those ways from the literature. First, we know that episodes of heavy bombardment could differentiate icy satellites. We also know that a large impact can actually break a mean motion resonance, and we know that impacts can warm and melt an ice shell, changing its thermal profile. We also know that craters on icy satellites imply more heat than our tidal models can account for. On the left, I'm showing some work on relaxed craters on Enceladus that indicate a very high surface temperature and high heat flows for an extended period of time. And you can see from this graphic that we're talking about craters at or above the equator, so pretty far away from the known heat source at the south pole of Enceladus. On the right, we see maps of relaxed craters on Dione and Tethys, and they're spatially variable with, in some cases, very high heat flows like 50 or 100 milliwatts per meter squared, isolated to certain locations. And finally, at the top, we have impact modeling for craters on Europa, which imply an ice shell thickness of 7 kilometers, whereas tidal heating models suggest thicknesses between 13 and 38 kilometers. So in all of these cases, we are missing a source of heat that would explain the observations. We also see a lot of evidence for more ocean worlds in the outer solar system, but again, the heat source is a challenge. For example, Dione, a moon of Saturn, where we have a lot of good gravity data, strongly supports a present-day subsurface ocean, but models that account for radiogenic heating in its rocky core and also tidal heating in the ice shell would not suggest that there's going to be an ocean. Similarly, Enceladus, which is even smaller than Dione, should have had an ocean that froze out quickly, but instead we find it even in the present day. And those high heat flows from the crater relaxation at Tethys are suggestive of a recent ocean. And there really isn't a good heat source for that, particularly with the low eccentricity of Tethys. So usually we suggest that maybe these moons have gone through an epoch of high eccentricity, and that's what kicked off an era of enhanced tidal heating. But here we want to look into what are the effects of impact-generated heating. So how might impacts drive tidal heating? Well, tidal heating depends on the orbit and rheology of a moon. And I've given some examples here, where on the left I've showed what it takes to get lower tidal heating. So you can have a low or no eccentricity, like at Tethys. You can have a large semi-major axis, like at Callisto. Or, like with Mimas, you can end up with a frozen interior so that you can't actually dissipate tidal energy. And you'll see Mimas is very close in to Saturn and has a high eccentricity, and yet we see no evidence of any kind of tidal heating or tidal fracturing. On the right, in contrast, we can get higher tidal heating with a higher eccentricity, a subsurface ocean that can respond to tides, a small semi-major axis, and warm ice. And that's because the timescale for the orbital periods of these moons coincide with tidal heating being generated most effectively in warm ice. And so that leads us to pose the question that if impacts could warm the shell to more responsive temperatures, could they then enhance tidal heating in some significant way? So this leads to two motivating questions. First, could global bombardment kick off enough tidal heating to have thinned Europa's ice shell to 10 kilometers? We're targeting that number based on those observations of crater depths to diameters. The second question is whether individual large impacts could lead to regional high heat fluxes that relax craters. And here we're thinking more about those craters on Saturn's moons. So as a starting point, we need to model both tidal heating in an ice shell and approximate the effects of an impact. So for the tides, we first assume a structure for a Europa-like body where we have ice over an ocean over a rocky interior. We impose a conductive thermal gradient in the ice shell, and then we compute tidal heating with a continuous thermal profile. And the use of a continuous profile is a departure from past work. And the reason that we want to do this is because, again, the different temperatures in the ice shell will respond to tidal forcing in different ways. And so we can actually put the heat right where it should be and then allow it to be transported through conduction upward and out of the ice shell. And then because we don't know what the basal heat flux is, the heat coming into the ice shell from below, we determine what what it would need to be in order to keep different ice shell thicknesses stable. And that's shown here on the right plot. So the x-axis is shell thickness, the y-axis is the tidal is the heat flux. The orange tells you how much heat's coming out of the surface, and the blue is how much heat needs to be going into the base. And you can see that for very thick shells, more than about 30 kilometers, it becomes very difficult to maintain such a thick shell because you can create so much tidal heating in the shell that it would want to melt back. In contrast, on the left side of the plot, very thin ice shells don't generate a lot of tidal heat. There's simply not enough volume to do it. And so you would need to have a very high basal heat flux in order to keep those ice shells as thin as we would want them to be. And so for this work, we've gone with a moderate 10 milliwatts per meter squared basal heat flux, which at the present day eccentricity gives us a stable ice shell thickness of 25.5 kilometers. Now to add the impact. So we approximate impact heating by adding a warm layer within the ice shell, and we used some of the previous modeling work to figure out what those parameters really ought to be. And this is consistent with an individual impact delivering heat to one specific location on Europa, with a typical ice shell thickness and tidal heating. And I say typical because both of those things may vary spatially, so we're just picking kind of an average. We then vary the total impact energy, and then using that impact energy, find a depth and a radial extent of a warm layer that would match the energy. And so that's going to depend on what the initial temperature is in the ice shell and what it takes to warm it to this 255 Kelvin that we're aiming for. We then compute tidal heating with the new thermal profile, and we find a stable ice shell thickness that would require the same basal heat flux as our initial no impact case. And on the right, on the bottom, I've shown one of our thermal profiles with tidal heating and no impact. And you can see that it doesn't really change much, which is good because we've picked a static case. So when we do add in that tidal heating or the impact heating, we see a pretty big change in how the tides respond. So looking at this plot of all the shell thicknesses, what we see is that impacts warm ice in the upper shell, triggering higher tidal dissipation, which means that you need less basal heating to reach the same amount of surface flux because you're creating more ice, more heat in the ice. And so I've shown some arrows here for some of the test cases that we've done. And what we generally find is that for the same shell thickness, you can lower your basal heat flux requirement and actually raise slightly the surface heat flux. What this means is that if you assume the basal heat flux isn't changing, and we wouldn't think it would from an impact, then the ice shell must thin to a different stable solution in order for this to work. And so on the left, we have the thermal profile with tidal heating and no impact. Now on the right, I'm showing the thermal profiles with tidal heating and an impact. So here, the orange line is the steady state without an impact. The green line is the new steady state post-impact. And so basically, we've taken the blue, which is that thermal pulse from the impact, and let it evolve, let the heat, the tidal heating increase, let it conduct through the ice shell until it finds a point of equilibrium. And what you can see is that the shell remains warmer and the thermal profile looks pretty different. So what we find is that impacts can actually make a lot of tidal heat. Here we have a Europa-sized body, present-day eccentricity, and a modest impact energy. Before the impact, which is on the left, we have an equilibrium shell thickness of 25.5 kilometers and a surface heat flux of 24 milliwatts per meter squared. Then we add this layer of warm ice and we find a steady state solution that also requires only 10 milliwatts per meter squared of basal heat flux, and we end up with the case on the right, which is an equilibrium shell thickness of 20.5 kilometers and a surface heat flux that's almost doubled to 44 milliwatts per meter squared. If we double the eccentricity of Europa, we can reduce the impact energy, and we get an equilibrium shell thickness without an impact of 14.4 kilometers, and it reduces to 10 kilometers after the impact. So taken together, we can see that for a global bombardment scenario, there would certainly be plenty of impact energy to warm and thin an ice shell. Depending on the eccentricity at the time of bombardment, impact-induced tidal heating could thin the shell to that 10 to 15 kilometers we're looking for, and impact-induced tidal heating can dramatically enhance heat flows. But there are some caveats. First, in order to address the long-term effects, we need to consider whether the orbit can circularize in response to a global enhanced dissipation event. Next, we need to test smaller moons to see if relaxation on Saturn's moons can be fit with this model. And finally, for those individual impacts, we need to consider lateral heat flowing away from the impact and also filling in the locally thinned regions. And while I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, I just wanted to put it up here. So there are some additional implications that we can ponder both about how this process might work and what else it might mean for how we interpret craters. Thank you.